The traveling case arrived at the auction house on a Tuesday morning in January, unremarkable except for its weight. Constance Weld had handled dozens of its kind. Battered leather, brass clasps gone green at the edges, the smell of camphor and old travel, and she did not expect anything from it. She was there to catalog, not to feel. She set it on the table, pressed the clasps open with her thumbs, and lifted the lid. The interior was empty, save for a lining of faded burgundy silk. She pressed her fingers along the seam, as she always did, in case something had slipped between fabric and wood. This was how they found things. Sometimes. A ring. A forgotten banknote. A sprig of lavender someone had pressed and carried across 3 countries. Her fingers found a stiffness along the left wall. Not a ring. Paper, folded many times, sewn carefully into the silk with small, neat stitches. Old stitches. Someone had meant for this to stay hidden. She hesitated. Outside, the Bath Street carried its ordinary noise: horses, a vendor, the hollow ring of a cartwheel on stone. She took the small knife she used for cataloging and cut the stitches. The paper unfolded into 4 neat panels. The handwriting was thick and deliberate, the hand of a man accustomed to authority. At the top, a date, the 14th of March, 1814. At the bottom, a name she recognized before she reached it: Edmund Ashford, Duke of Aldermere. She read the first line. She stopped. She read it again. Her father's name was in the second sentence. If you are finding this, she would later remember thinking, then it is already too late for the man who wrote it. It was already too late for her father, too. The truth remained, however, and truth, she had learned since coming to Bath, did not require a sponsor. It simply required someone willing to hold it. Her hands did not shake. She folded the letter with care and placed it inside her apron pocket, against her chest, where she could feel its weight for the rest of the afternoon. She finished the catalog. She walked back to the printer's shop on Milsom Street. She said good evening to Mr. Dawson and climbed the stairs to her room. And only then, with the door closed and the single candle lit, did she sit on the edge of her narrow bed and read every word. It had been 2 years since she had slept in her own house. 2 years since she had woken to a view she knew by heart: the elm trees in the lower field, the stone wall her father had repaired himself the summer before. He took ill. The kitchen garden where her mother had grown lavender that came back faithfully every spring, regardless of who owned the ground. She was 22 when she lost it. She was 24 now, and the loss had settled into something she did not call grief, because grief implied the possibility of return. She had learned to call it simply the before. Her father, Henry Weld, had been a gentleman of modest means and impeccable character, the kind of man whose word was his bond, precisely because he had little else to offer for surety. He had died in the spring of 1815, owing, according to the documents produced by the late Duke of Aldermere's solicitors, a sum of £4,000 to the Aldermere estate. Constance had not known of any such debt. She had asked to see the original documentation. The solicitors had produced papers she could not refute. She had been 30 years old in her father's study, surrounded by books she had read twice each, and she had not been able to find the seam in the story, the place where it changed from truth to invention. She had sold what she could, signed what she was told to sign, and removed herself to Bath, where Mrs. Hewitt, an old friend of her father's and widow of the man who had apprenticed him years ago, had found her a position at the printer's shop on Milsom Street. To the printer's trade, she was simply Miss Weld. To Bath's assembly rooms, when she occasionally appeared at the edge of them, she was the printer's girl, a phrase that carried in its single soft syllable all the weight of what the season had decided she was worth. She had heard it spoken behind a fan at the pump room in October. She had let it pass through her and said nothing. There was a kind of freedom, she had discovered, in a verdict you did not bother to contest. The season was not the final judge. She had always believed that. The letter in the late Duke's hand was the first evidence she had ever held that she had been right. She went to Aldermere House the following morning. She told no one. She put on her best gown, a plain ivory with a high waist and long sleeves, and her green Spencer jacket, which had once been a good one and still held its color if you did not look too closely at the elbows. She wore her good gloves and carried the letter inside a leather document case she had borrowed from the shop's supply cupboard. She was shown into the front hall by a footman who did not quite conceal his assessment of her. She gave her name. She waited. Julian Ashford, Duke of Aldermere, kept her waiting 11 minutes. She counted them by the clock on the hall table. When he came down the stairs, she had time to observe him before he saw her. Tall, very dark hair, a face that had settled into something guarded and still in the way that faces do when they have been guarded for a long time. He wore a navy coat and a white cravat and moved with the unhurried authority of a man who had never needed to hurry. His eyes, when they found her, were the color of slate after rain. They assessed her in a single beat. She met them steadily. "Miss Weld," he said. His voice was even. "Your Grace." She did not curtsy more than the minimum courtesy required. "I apologize for arriving without an appointment. I believe the matter I carry warrants the imposition." He looked at the document case. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Come through." He took her to the library. It was a long room with windows facing the street, books in mahogany cases floor to ceiling, a fire in the grate, and the smell of old leather and recent pipe smoke. He did not ask her to sit. She sat anyway, in a chair near the fire, and opened the document case and placed the letter on the desk between them. He picked it up. He stood while he read it, which told her something. A man who needed to brace himself stood while he received difficult news. She watched his face and let him have the silence. He read it twice. She knew when he read it twice because she saw his eyes return to the top of the page. His face did not collapse. That was the first thing. It shifted, fractionally, in the area of the jaw and in the set of his mouth, in the way that faces shift when something suspected for a long time is finally confirmed in ink. She had expected anger, or denial, or the measured composure of a man who intended to dispute the document's provenance. She had not expected grief. And it was not precisely grief, but it was adjacent to it. A particular stillness that belonged to people who were discovering something they already knew. He set the letter down. "Where did you find this?" he said. She told him. His expression did not change further. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a moment, looking at the gray January street. When he turned, he had composed himself entirely, which was its own kind of answer. "I require time to verify the document," he said. "Of course," she said. "I would expect nothing less." He looked at her. Something moved in his eyes that was not quite an apology and not quite recognition, and was entirely unreadable to her. "You may leave the letter with me," he said. "I give you my word. It will not be destroyed." She considered this. She had come here expecting a fight, a cold dismissal, a threat delivered through a solicitor's careful language. She had not expected a man who said, "I give you my word," and sounded as though he meant it. She thought of her father, who had said such things in the same tone. She thought of the late Duke, who had written his confession in the same hand that had signed her father's ruin. She thought about what it might mean to trust a man whose name was the same as the crime. Very well, she said. She rose. She gathered the document case. At the library door she paused, though she had not planned to. Your Grace, she said. He turned. My father's name was Henry Weld. He was an honest man. She said it plainly, without performance. I thought you should know the name of the man your father ruined. She left before he could answer. He came to the printer's shop on Milsom Street 4 days later. He did not announce himself in advance. She was setting type at the compositor's table when Mr. Dawson appeared at the back room door with an expression she had never seen on his face before. The Duke of Aldermere was in the front shop, he said. He wished a commission discussed if Miss Weld was available. She was not surprised. She dried her hands and went through. He was standing at the counter, examining a sample page she had typeset the previous afternoon. He held it at the angle of someone who actually reads, not someone who performs reading while waiting. When she appeared, he set it down. Your work? He said. Yes. It is very precise. Precision is the trade's first requirement, she said. Have you a commission, Your Grace? Or did you come to discuss my typography? The corner of his mouth moved. Only slightly. She thought it might have been the beginning of something, quickly suppressed. I came, he said, his voice carefully level, to tell you that I have compared my father's letter against 3 authenticated examples of his hand. The document is genuine. I have retained Pemberton and Hale to examine the original debt documentation. She kept her own face quiet. She had not known until this moment how much she had been afraid he would not come back. I see, she said. Miss Weld. He said her name the way he said everything, measured, deliberate, with the quality of a man who has chosen each word and is prepared to stand by it. This will require time. Whatever my father did or did not do, the remedy has a legal shape. I would ask you not to approach anyone else with the letter until I have had opportunity to establish that shape. You would ask, she said. Or you would require. He regarded her. Ask, he said. You are not obliged to me. She ought to have left it there. She said, without quite intending to. That is the first thing you have said that I believe without reservation. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I will come again Thursday, if that is acceptable. There are questions about the timeline of the original claim. It is acceptable, she said. He left, and she went back to the compositor's table, and she made 3 errors in the next half hour that she had to pull and reset. Her hands, usually so steady, kept losing their place. He came Thursday, and the Thursday after that. The second visit, the Dowager called him into the drawing room of Aldermere House before he left, and he went. The Dowager Duchess Frances Ashford had the kind of face that had always known how to arrange itself for effect, and she arranged it now into the particular expression she reserved for problems she intended to manage quietly before they became visible ones. The printer's girl, she said, without looking up from her needlework. Julian, I do hope you are not making this into something that requires management. I am conducting an investigation into my father's papers, he said. It is an administrative matter. Then let Pemberton conduct it, she said. She pressed the needle through the silk. Your visits to Milsom Street have been noticed. The season will talk. The season may do as it likes, he said. She looked up then. Her eyes were his in color, but not in temperature. She is nobody, Lady Ashford said pleasantly. Whatever her father may or may not have been, she makes her living at a printer's. I will not have Aldermere's heir associated with a printer's girl. He did not answer. He bowed and left, and she watched him go with the confidence of a woman who has never had to say a thing twice to have it done. It was on his 3rd visit to Milsom Street that he saw what he did not know he had been waiting to see. He arrived a quarter of an hour early, a solicitor's errand having concluded faster than expected, and was shown through to the back room by Mr. Dawson, who assumed he was expected. He stopped in the doorway. Constance was seated at a small table in the corner opposite her compositor's station, reading aloud to Mrs. Hewitt, who was perhaps 70, and sat in the corner chair with her hands folded, and her eyes closed in the attitude of someone receiving something they had needed for a long time. Constance was reading Cowper. Her voice was low and unhurried, with the careful musicality of a woman who had spent years reading aloud to her father and knew what it meant to give a text room. She did not see him. She turned a page without looking up. Mrs. Hewitt opened one eye, regarded him, and closed it again. He stood in the doorway for considerably longer than was strictly necessary. He told himself later he was waiting for a natural pause. He was not. He was watching the way her face softened around a good line, the way she tilted her head slightly at the turn of a stanza, the way the ink on her right hand caught the weak winter light from the high window. He was watching a woman do a small, private, unnecessary act of kindness for an old woman who had no social connection left in Bath except this printer's shop and the girl who read to her on slow afternoons. When she reached the end of a poem and looked up to turn the page, she saw him. She did not blush. She did not fumble or apologize. She simply said, calmly, "Your Grace," and closed the book with one finger marking her place. And Mrs. Hewitt opened both eyes and said, "I'll leave you to it," and departed with a spryness that suggested she had not been as absorbed as she appeared. "Cowper," he said. "He is easy to read aloud," she said. "Short lines, good commas. You have that concern about everything, I notice. Readability, rhythm. It is an occupational requirement." She was still sitting. He was still standing. Neither of them moved toward the other, and neither of them moved away. And the room felt smaller than its dimensions could account for. "You had questions about the timeline," she said. "Not a question. A rescue." "Yes," he said, and sat down across from her, and took out his notes. And they worked for an hour on dates and figures, and neither of them said anything that was not required by the documentation. He left when the clock at the cathedral struck 4. He returned on Tuesday of the following week with a second document. Not the solicitor's notes, but a letter. Small, personal, folded twice. He held it for a moment before he placed it on the table. "This," he said, "is not connected to the claim. I brought it because I thought you might understand why it matters to me that it exists." She picked it up. It was from his father. She could tell the hand immediately. Dated 1808, when Julian Ashford would have been approximately 17 years old. It was a letter to his son from a father at the end of a disappointed visit. Cold, instructional, measured in a way that cut more deeply for its precision. It did not call him unworthy. It simply proceeded as though his worth were a given that had failed to materialize. It spoke of duty and name and the weight of Aldermere's reputation, and it said nothing at all about the boy who was being asked to carry it. She read it to the end. She set it down. "He sent this to you," she said. "Yes." He was looking at the table, not at her. "I found the hidden letter, Miss Weld, and I was not surprised by it. That is the thing I cannot quite account for." He stopped. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the table, a small unconscious motion she recognized as the equivalent of composing oneself. "My father was a man who arranged things. Property. People. Reputation. He arranged them according to what suited Aldermere, and he did not stop to ask what they might prefer. I knew this. I chose not to know it fully. because it would have made things very difficult. He looked up. His eyes were quiet and very direct. I'm telling you this because you are owed the honesty. I was not ignorant of what my father was. I simply did not have proof. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a cart passed. The fire settled. My father kept a small portrait of my mother on his writing desk, she said. He moved it every time he sat down to write and replaced it when he rose. It annoyed his clerk considerably. She paused. He was a man who remembered the people around him. Every day. Without thinking about it. I do not think he would have been capable of hiding a letter like that one. She looked at the folded confession on the table between them. I think that is why your father wrote it. Because my father could not have been made to do it. He said nothing. His jaw was tight. Something was happening in his face that she could not read entirely, and did not try. I am sorry, she said, for the father he was. He nodded once, and after a moment he said quietly, I am sorry for the harm he did to yours. They sat with this for a little while. She did not try to fill the silence, and neither did he. If you are still with this story, leave a quiet word in the comments. Stories like this one were not supposed to survive. Sometimes they need a witness. It was Mrs. Hewitt who warned her, a week later, that the Dowager had been asking questions. She said it in the manner of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the shape of particular kinds of danger. Not dramatic, not rushing, but certain, the way a tide is certain. The Dowager Duchess had spoken to the servant who found the traveling case, she said. She had spoken to the auctioneer. She was drawing a perimeter around the letter's provenance, preparing to contest it. The confrontation came at the assembly rooms on a Wednesday evening in late February, where Constance had accompanied Mrs. Hewitt at the old woman's insistence. She had not wanted to come. She was standing near the wall with a glass of wine she did not intend to drink when she heard her name spoken nearby, by a woman she did not know, but whose tone she recognized at once. The printer's girl, the woman said to her companion, behind a fan that did not fully conceal the motion of her lips. She has been making accusations against the late Duke, I hear. Very bold, for someone who makes her living setting type. A small laugh. The assembly will not credit it for a moment. Constance did not move. She did not turn. She let the words pass through her, the way January cold passes through a thin gown, completely and without surprise. And then Lady Ashford was there. She had appeared at the edge of Constance's vision, moving with the unhurried authority of a woman who has never needed to rush toward anything, because everything has always come to her. She wore deep green and diamonds. Her hair was perfectly arranged. She was smiling in the way that certain women smile, not at you, but at the space around you, at the social geometry they are about to rearrange. Miss Weld, she said. What a surprise. I had not expected to see you here. Mrs. Hewitt was kind enough to include me, Constance said. Charming. Lady Ashford's eyes moved over her with the quick, practiced assessment of a woman who had spent 40 years calculating advantage at a glance. I wonder, she said, her voice remaining warm and pleasant, if you and I might speak privately. There is a matter concerning my late husband's papers that I believe has been misunderstood. She took Constance's elbow without waiting for assent, and drew her into the adjoining corridor with the gentle firmness of someone accustomed to moving people where she needed them. The document you found, the Dowager said, once the assembly room noise had receded to a murmur behind the closed door, is not what you believe it to be. My late husband's hand was forged on multiple occasions in his final year. I have the testimony of his physician and his secretary to that effect. Her voice was still pleasant. It was the most chilling thing about her, that the pleasantness never changed, whatever she was actually doing. I would be very sorry if a young woman of no particular position in this city were to find herself the subject of a slander action brought by the Aldermere estate. Very sorry indeed. Constance looked at her. She thought of her father, who had stood in a solicitor's office with documents he could not refute and a story he could not disprove, and who had done the only thing left to him, which was to sign. She thought of the letter sewn inside the silk lining. She thought of his face when he had read it. "Lady Ashford," she said, "I am sure you believe you are protecting your family." "I am." "Then I would ask you to consider," Constance said, "what your family actually needs protection from." She paused. Her voice was level. She had not planned the words. They were simply there. "The late Duke wrote that letter himself. If it is forged, a court will determine that. I am prepared to allow a court to determine it." The dowager's smile did not waver. Her eyes changed fractionally, a calculation, a reassessment, the swift recognition that she had not brought quite enough force. "The printer's girl," she said, and this time the phrase was not pleasantry, but inventory, the final rendering of a verdict. "You understand nothing about what you are walking into." "I understand," Constance said, "that my father was honest. I find that sufficient." She excused herself and returned to the ballroom. He was there. He had arrived while she was in the corridor. She saw him across the room, and he saw her. And there was a moment in which she was certain he had witnessed nothing and would do nothing. Because what could he do? Here. With his mother still in the corridor, and the season watching, and a name to protect that his father had already spent 30 years spending. She looked away. She found Mrs. Hewitt. She said she had a headache and wished to go home. She booked passage on a post-chaise leaving Bath the following morning. She told herself it was practical. She told herself she had an aunt in Wiltshire who had been expecting her for months, and that the matter of the letter was now sufficiently documented to proceed through a solicitor without her presence in Bath. She told herself she was not fleeing. She believed one of these three things, intermittently, throughout the night. The chaise left at 7:30. She had been seated inside it for 40 minutes, watching the grey English countryside pass in the pale early light, when the chaise slowed and stopped. She heard voices outside. The door opened. He stood on the verge of the road in his coat and boots, without a hat, which meant he had ridden, and the hat had gone somewhere. A bay horse stood behind him, being held by a groom, whose expression suggested this was not the most irregular morning he had ever served. "Come back," he said. She looked at him. "Your Grace." "Come back to Bath," he said. "Pemberton arrives at 2 o'clock. Your presence is required for the formal attestation. You are the legal claimant." He said it crisply, procedurally, as though it were self-evident, as though he had simply ridden out on a cold February morning to deliver a legal reminder. She regarded him for a moment. The early light was pale and cold, and it sat on his face without flattery, which meant she could see clearly that he had not slept, and that his jaw was set in the way it set when he was holding something with both hands that he could not yet afford to drop, and that his eyes, which were always steady, were as steady as she had ever seen them, which meant he was feeling something he was not going to say. "Pemberton requires my presence," she said. "Yes. And that is why you rode out at 7:30 without a hat." Something moved across his face. She thought it might have been, very briefly, almost something like relief. "The hat was an oversight," he said. "I was in haste." "I see," she said. She gathered her bag. She stepped down from the chaise. The morning air was very cold and smelled of frost and cut grass and the horse standing behind him. and she was aware of his proximity in the way that the body knows such things before the mind does, a warmth across the few feet between them that the cold air did not account for. "Miss Weld," he said. He was looking at her. His voice was quieter now, without the procedural crispness. "I saw what happened at the assembly rooms. I should have intervened. I did not. And I know what it looked like." "You had your family to consider," she said. "I had my mother's strategy to consider," he said, "which is not the same thing. I should like you to know that I have considered it, and that I have made my decision, and that it is not the one she intended." She looked up at him. He was very close, in the way that standing on a road verge in the cold produces a natural proximity, and she was aware of his eyes, and the slight indentation at his left cheekbone, and the steadiness that he carried the way her father had carried his word, as something he did not offer casually and did not retract. Her heart was audible to her in a way she had no rational explanation for. Her hands, in her good gloves, were entirely still, which was the one thing about her that was not paying attention to him. "Very well," she said. "I will come back." He offered his arm. She took it, and they walked back to the waiting chaise together, and he handed her in, and he rode the bay horse alongside the chaise all the way to Bath, and she looked out the window at the gray fields and the pale sky, and she did not try to make herself feel less than she felt. The drawing-room of Aldermere House at 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the 23rd of February, 1817, held the following persons: Lord Pemberton, who was 70 and had known the late Duke since before Julian was born; Mr. Hallett, the solicitor retained to examine the Weld documentation; Lady Ashford, who had been given no choice about her attendance; Miss Clara Norris, Lady Ashford's niece, who had been visiting and who was present as family witness; and Constance Weld, standing near the window with her hands folded and her face composed, in her ivory gown and her green Spencer jacket. Julian came in last. He stood at the head of the room, and he did not sit down. "Lord Pemberton," he said, "I have asked you here as a witness of standing, and as a man who knew my father over many years. What I am about to present concerns the conduct of the Aldermere estate under my father's tenure, and I want the record of this meeting to be attested by a peer of this realm who had no part in the matter I am about to address." Lord Pemberton nodded. He had the manner of a man who has seen many difficult things and is not easily surprised by them. Julian took the letter from his inside coat pocket. He read it aloud. He read all of it. Without inflection and without pause, his voice steady and even throughout, in the manner of a man who has decided to bear the full weight of what he is carrying rather than set it down in pieces. Lady Ashford sat very still. Miss Norris looked at her hands. When he finished, he placed the letter on the table. "Mr. Hallett," he said, "will you confirm your examination of the original debt documentation?" The solicitor confirmed it. The claim against Henry Weld had been constructed on the basis of a promissory note that bore a date inconsistent with the correspondence record and a witness signature belonging to a man who had died 6 months prior to the note's supposed execution. The debt had been fabricated. The estate transfer was unlawful. Lord Pemberton said, in the mild tone of a very old man who has decided what the correct thing is and intends to say it without drama, "Then the matter is clear." Lady Ashford said, "Julian?" She said it the way she had said things to him all his life, as though the word itself were a command. "You will not do this." He looked at her. He was very quiet. He said, "I will not do what my father did, which is to know what was true and act as though it were not." He turned. He looked at Constance. "Miss Weld's claim stands," he said. She is under my protection now. 10 words. Specific. Irrevocable. In front of Lord Pemberton and a solicitor and his mother and the draughty Bath drawing room with its pale February light. Lady Ashford sat entirely still for a moment. Then something in her posture shifted. Not collapse, not drama, but the specific subsidence of a woman who has run her best strategy and found the ground not there. She looked briefly very tired. Constance did not look at her with triumph. She looked at her with the recognition of a woman who understood what it cost to be wrong, inside a life built around being right. Lord Pemberton rose, took the letter from the table, and tucked it inside his coat. "I will have this attested at Gray's Inn before the week is out," he said. "Miss Weld, you will hear from Hallett's office regarding the formal restoration of title. These things take time, but the path is clear." He looked at Julian. He nodded once, in the manner of a man whose nod means something. The room began to settle. Constance was standing at the window. Julian crossed the room. He stood beside her. The light was pale and cold, and it came in at an angle that made everything look slightly more real than it was, the way winter light sometimes does. "Weld Cottage," he said quietly. "Hallett tells me it is still intact. It was not part of the estate transfer proper. It may be possible to have you in it before spring." "I know it," she said. "My father used to take his morning coffee there. He said the light came in differently than at the house." "The house will follow," he said. "These things take time." "I am not afraid of time," she said. She turned to look at him. He was very close, and she did not step back, and he did not look away. "Your Grace," she said. "What you did today. What I should have done 3 months ago," he said. "No," she said. "What you did today was sufficient. It was more than sufficient." She stopped. She was about to say something careful and managed, and she did not say it. She said instead quietly, "You rode out after the chaise without a hat." "I did," he said, "in February. It was not a particularly rational decision," he said. "No," she said. "It was not." Her voice was very low. "I found it, on balance, rather reassuring." His face did something she had not seen it do before. The set of his mouth released, fractionally, and his eyes, which were always steady, went warm in a way that she thought he was probably not accustomed to permitting. He said, "Constance?" Her given name in his voice was a marked event. She felt it in the way the body registers things it has been waiting for, without knowing it was waiting. "Julian," she said equally quietly. And he looked at her as though she had given him something he was uncertain he deserved, which was perhaps the truest thing she had seen on a human face in 2 years. By March, she was sleeping in her own room at Weld Cottage, under a sky she knew by heart. The legal work proceeded in the particular slow and patient way of legal things, Hallett sending letters every 2 weeks with updates she read carefully at the kitchen table with her morning tea. The main house remained in resolution, which would take the better part of a year. The cottage was enough for now. The cottage was a great deal. The small oval portrait of her father sat on the mantelpiece in the sitting room. She had placed it there the first evening, when she carried her one bag upstairs and came back down and built a fire and sat before it in the gathering dark. Henry Weld looked back at her in oils, in his good coat, with the expression of a man who did not expect more than he deserved, and did not ask for less. She had not cried. She had said into the quiet room, "I found it. Your name in his hand. I found it. And I brought it forward. And it is done." The fire had answered in the way fires do, with nothing and everything at once. Julian came on a Thursday afternoon in the first week of March. He knocked, which she had told him was unnecessary. He came in and stood in the sitting room doorway and looked at the portrait on the mantelpiece. "Your father," he said. "Yes." He looked at it for a moment. "He was not very old," he said. "He was 53 when he died," she said. "He said that was a good age for a man who had never accumulated more regret than he could carry." Something moved in his face. He sat down in the chair she had placed near the window, the one that caught the afternoon light. And she sat across from him. And for a while they were simply two people in a cottage with a fire and a portrait, and the sound of the March wind coming off the fields outside. He had brought a book. He did this sometimes, arriving with something he thought she had not read, which she usually had, and which they discussed in the patient circling manner of two people who are talking about something else entirely while they talk about books. Today it was Crabbe. She had read it twice. She said so. He said he had suspected as much and brought it anyway. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. His slate-gray eyes were warmer than she had first thought them in the cottage light. "Because," he said, "I wanted a reason to come, and it was either Crabbe or telling you the truth directly, and Crabbe seemed less likely to frighten you off." She was very still. "Constance," he said. He said her name the way he had said it in the Aldermere drawing room, as a marked event. "I am going to say something that I would prefer to say without the intermediate comfort of a book of poetry." "Say it," she said. "I do not want to be my father," he said. "I do not want to hold what I feel at arm's length until it is too late to feel it properly. I want to be the kind of man who rode out after a post-chaise in February without a hat, not merely once, but reliably, for as long as you will permit it." He paused. He was not a man who paused often, and when he did, she had learned, it was because he was about to say something he had chosen very carefully. "I am not a simple man," he said. "My father left me a complicated inheritance in more ways than one. I know what I see when I see you. I have known it since you sat in my library and said that your father was an honest man, and said it as though the fact of honesty were its own sufficient argument. Which I believe it is." She looked at him. Her chest was tight in a way she had no intention of calling by any smaller name. "You are not a simple man," she agreed. "Fortunately," she said, "I have been setting type for 2 years. I am accustomed to complicated structures that nonetheless produce something readable in the end." He made a sound that she realized, with some amazement, was a laugh, brief, genuine, startled out of him. She had not heard him laugh before. It was not what she had expected. It was considerably better. "Then you will give me the opportunity to produce something readable," he said. "I think," she said, "that you already have." He reached across the small table between them. His hand found hers. He did not take it dramatically. He simply placed his hand over hers on the arm of her chair and held it. And she turned her hand over so they were palm to palm. And they sat like that in the cottage's afternoon light. Two people who had both learned what it cost to lose a father, and had found, in the unasked-for collision of their respective losses, something they had not known they were looking for. The letter, the hidden letter, the confession, was locked in a small box in the cottage's desk drawer. Constance had taken it back from Lord Pemberton once the attestation was complete. She did not take it out. She did not need to read it again. She knew every word of it. The way you know the shape of a scar you have stopped looking at. It was there, and it was sealed, and it was hers, and that was enough. The elm trees in the lower field were beginning, at the tips, to think about spring. Her father's face on the mantelpiece looked out with the expression of a man who had always believed the world would sort itself out. given sufficient time and honest conduct, and who had not lived to see it, but had, she thought, known it was coming. The fire burned on. Julian's hand was warm in hers. Outside, the first of the year's light was changing, the particular shift of a March afternoon in the English countryside, where the days are just beginning to remember what they can become. If Constance's story moved you, leave a word in the comments. Thank you for staying until the end.